share both a PDF of the slides and a link to the recording afterwards. And let's do a little housekeeping. Ask questions using the Q&A function throughout the webinar, and we'll address them at the end. If you're having trouble with audio, use the More Options icon at the bottom of the webinar screen to select Audio Options and switch from computer to phone audio. If all else fails, you can always watch the recording afterwards. The Farm to School program at USDA and the Farm to School Grant Program in particular were both created in the Richard B. Russell National School Lunch Act in 2010. The legislation directed USDA to support farm to school programs that improve access to local foods in eligible schools. At USDA, it's our Office of Community Food Systems, housed within the Food and Nutrition Service, that administers the USDA Farm to School Grant Program in partnership with Dun and the Grants Management team. Our office takes this legislative mandate for the grant program and translates it practically into a grant opportunity through a document called the Request for Applications, or RFA. This document contains literally everything you need to know about applying for a USDA Farm to School grant, and we'll reference it a lot throughout this webinar. Be sure you're looking at the RFA for this current grant year cycle, which is fiscal year 2020. We have a couple of other handy materials to help with the application process on our website. The National School Lunch Act legislation provides our office with some goals and parameters of the grant program. For example, it instructs our office to ensure that awards are distributed equitably across different types of communities. It also creates some priorities for the grant program, and you'll see these priorities mentioned throughout the RFA. For example, the legislation puts an emphasis on agricultural education alongside local purchasing efforts and encourages USDA to consider long-term program sustainability for grant projects. The first USDA Farm to School grants were awarded in 2013, and since then we've awarded over $40 million to 563 projects in all 50 states, DC, the Virgin Islands, Puerto Rico, and Guam. It's a competitive program. Just over half of applicants last year received awards. This year, we expect to award up to $10 million in grant funds. Many different organizations can apply for Farm to School grants. Each organization can only submit one application as the lead applicant, but can partner with other lead applicants on multiple applications. When applying, you'll be asked to make clear in your application what type of eligible entity you are so that we can be sure if you're eligible or not. Unfortunately, not everyone can apply for USDA Farm to School grants. For example, colleges, universities, and cooperative extension programs are not eligible to apply. However, these entities can be key partners, contractors, or provide sources of the required non-federal match for the grant program. In order to ensure that grant program funds are distributed broadly, organizations that have received grants in the past 3 funding cycles, so received funds in 2017, 2018, or 2019, are not eligible for implementation grants in FY 2020. Organizations that have received planning grants in the past are eligible to apply as long as their grant projects are closed out by the time the RFA closes on December 13th. State agencies are eligible to apply regardless of their past grant history or current grant status. Organizations that have received grants in prior years may still be partners or contractors associated with other applications or contribute to a match but can't actually apply as the lead applicant. Applicants must choose one of 3 grant tracks when they apply to a farm-to-school grant. The planning grant track is for organizations that are relatively new to farm-to-school and want to develop an action plan for how to implement a comprehensive farm-to-school program. The implementation grant track is for organizations with farm-to-school experience that have a specific project or projects in mind to accomplish. The state agency grant track is a new track this year, specifically for state agencies looking to support farm-to-school efforts in their states. You can see the timeline for the planning grants is 1 year, and implementation and state agency grants can be either 1 or 2 years. Planning grants are $20,000 to $50,000 each, whereas implementation and state agency grants may range from $50,000 to $100,000 each. There is no longer a training track as there was in years past. Training may be an eligible activity for any of the grant tracks. Who can apply for each grant track? I mentioned the eligible entities earlier. You'll notice that only state agencies can apply for the state agency track, and they are not eligible for the planning or implementation grant tracks. Regardless of who applies, the funding is intended only for projects that will ultimately benefit children in grades pre-K through 12 schools, served through the National School Lunch Program, School Breakfast Program, Child and Adult Care Food Service Program, and/or Seamless Summer Option, and Summer Food Service Program. Collectively, these are referred to as federal child nutrition programs. State agencies are the exception. They may receive funding for projects that serve child nutrition programs not located in pre-K through 12 schools, such as child care centers, family daycare homes, or community summer meal sites. Let's take a look at these different grant tracks in more detail. The objective of the planning grant track is that applicants will set the process in motion to develop a comprehensive farm-to-school program, one that incorporates both local procurement and agricultural education. It is designed for those new to farm-to-school who by the end of the grant period will create an action plan with the goals, specific activities, timelines, and people or partners responsible for implementing a farm-to-school program. Additionally, letters of commitment are required for key grant partners, and letters of match are required to describe the funds or support that comprise the non-federal match. The main purpose of the planning grant track is for grantees to develop an action plan, and therefore it's a required activity. Additionally, planning grantees must attend a mandatory in-person grantee training meeting. In order to develop the action plan, planning track activities might include creating a farm-to-school leadership team, conducting a needs assessment, or any of the other sample activities listed here, or other activities proposed by applicants. Remember, all of the activities must align with the overall planning track objective listed here at the bottom. Activities are provided in more detail in the RFA. When applying to the planning grant track, applicants must submit a proposal narrative, which is broken down into these sections. The narrative will be scored based on the applicant's responses to specific questions listed in the RFA that fall under each of these categories. In addition to the proposal narrative, a project work plan table is required. This table will help reviewers understand the overall project activities, timeline, target audience, and who is responsible for accomplishing each activity. This example project work plan table shown here is provided in the RFA. Label the required activities as required, just as they are in this table, and then additional grant project activities pertaining to your project will be categorized as associated with local procurement, agricultural education, or both. The implementation track is for eligible entities more experienced with farm to school, and they're designed to implement or expand comprehensive farm to school programming. Here are some examples of activities that might comprise a project in the implementation track, ranging from training producers to expanding distribution options to providing agricultural education opportunities. Allowable activities are described in more detail in the RFA and must align with the objective for this track. While there is no required action plan for this grant track, the in-person grantee training meeting in the first year of the grant award period is required. The proposal narrative for the implementation track is similar to the planning grant track, except the prompts listed in the RFA for each section are slightly different, reflecting the different scope and objective of this track. The project work plan is also required for the implementation grant track. You'll see the required in-person training listed here and additional activities categorized as local procurement, agricultural education, or both. The state agency track is for, as the name implies, only state agencies, such as departments of agriculture, education, or health. The objective of this grant track is for state agencies to support farm-to-school programming in all federal child nutrition programs, including, for example, in meals or snacks served in child care centers or community summer meal programs. So this is a bit different from the planning and implementation tracks, whereby funding is for pre-K through 12 school-based programming only. Note the emphasis is still on comprehensive programs that include both local procurement and agricultural education efforts. These are examples of allowable activities for grant projects in the state agency track. Note that the grantee training meeting hosted by USDA is optional for this track, so applicants may or may not choose to include it as an activity and may or may not choose to include travel to the meeting in their budget. State agencies may conduct a wide range of activities, from facilitating peer-to-peer learning among programs, to hosting buyer-grower meetings, to supporting local agricultural education efforts. Note that these are just a list of possible activities, and applicants may include additional activities that align with this track's objective listed here. Again, the proposal narrative required of state agency track applicants is similar to the other tracks, with prompts for applicants to respond to customized to the specifics of this track. The project work plan table is also required of state agency track applicants. You'll note that there are no required specific activities for this track, as the grantee training is optional. Applicants to all grant tracks may receive bonus priority points during the selection process if they fall into either of these priority categories. Applicants can declare if they meet one or more priority group categories using the form in Appendix D of the RFA. This form also describes how these bonus priority points will be awarded. Note that these are not requirements for receiving an award, but rather priorities that will give your application a boost. If you're worried you might not remember all of the requirements of this grant if your project is selected to receive funding, never fear. If your organization is awarded, you'll be sent detailed terms and conditions outlining all of the requirements, ranging from reporting to using the USDA logo. Our team will also support awarded grantees throughout the grant period of performance. Let's move on to talk a little bit about the budget. In addition to the project narrative and project work plan, all applicants are required to provide information about their budgets. The total grant project budget is comprised of the federal funds, also called the grant award, and a match that comes from non-federal sources. USDA will contribute no more than 75% of the total project cost. Therefore, the non-federal match must be at least 25% of that total project cost. Not 25% of the federal portion, 25% of the total project cost. This match can come from cash or in-kind services, such as the value of facilities, equipment, or services provided. Here's an example match calculation, and there's a tool to help you calculate the match required on our website. All grant costs in the budget must be reasonable, allocable, and necessary. They must be reasonable, meaning they must fall within the scope of allowable costs, and a prudent person in similar circumstances would incur the cost at the proposed rate. Costs must be allocable, meaning they must be directly related to specific grant activities and contribute to grant objectives. And they must be necessary. Costs must be essential to accomplishing the grant objectives. Here are some examples of allowable and unallowable costs under the guise of this grant program. These are described in more detail in the RFA in Appendix C. It is worth noting that these allowable costs apply to both the federal award and the non-federal match. So matching funds must also be allowable according to the parameters of this grant program. It looks like we are getting some great questions. Keep those questions coming, and we will answer them as soon as we get to the end of the presentation. In order to describe the project budget, applicants must provide a completed SF-424A form. The first page of this form summarizes the amount requested from the federal government through this award. The second line is for the non-federal match, with the total at the bottom as shown on this example. The second page of the SF-424A is where you'll provide a breakdown of the federal amount requested and non-federal match by category. The categories are personnel, benefits, travel, equipment, supplies, contractual, and other. There's a line for construction, but it's not allowed as an expense through this grant program. These will be totaled as direct charges, and applicants may choose to apply an indirect rate. In addition to the SF-424A, applicants must submit a budget narrative to provide more detail about the costs associated with the grant project. Make sure the information on the SF-424A and the budget narrative align with each other and align with the rest of the grant application materials. First, the budget narrative should have an overall budget description with the source of the matching funds as shown in this example, which is also provided on our website. A funding request summary should follow, outlining the federal and non-federal match components of the project budget by category. Then, the budget narrative will describe every line item in the budget by category, justifying each proposed cost. This section should clearly align with the activities described in the proposal narrative and the project work plan. Here's an example for the personnel and fringe benefits categories from the example budget narrative provided on our website. Presumably, this wellness coordinator's role in the grant project was outlined in the proposal narrative and project work plans, so we can determine if this cost is reasonable, allocable, and necessary. The more information you can provide in this section, the better, so that we can get the full picture of your proposed budget. Okay, now we're going to switch gears and talk about how to actually submit an application to the USDA Farm to School Grant Program. The RFA has a lot of useful information, and this application checklist on page 5 of the RFA is no exception. This will help assure that you have a complete application when you go to submit it using the online portal for federal grants called Grants.gov. When it comes to submitting a grant through Grants.gov, there are a few steps that we'll go over in more detail. None of these steps have fees associated, but each may take a little while, so we encourage you to start early. Grants.gov has a 24-hour help desk, and an email address, a YouTube channel, and additional support for applicants. The first step is to obtain a Dun Bradstreet number, or DUNS number. DUNS is a separate system from Grants.gov, and it's required by the government to better identify related organizations that are receiving federal funding and to provide consistent name and address data for electronic grant application systems. After receiving a DUNS number, applicants must register with SAM. This is the federal government's system for award management. To register, you will need your DUNS number as well as your taxpayer identification number, your bank's routing number, account number, and account type. A SAM account is necessary in order to conduct business with the government. Pay attention to the emails you get from SAM. They may instruct you to take further action to set up your account. After getting your DUNS number and registering in SAM, you must now create an account in Grants.gov. On the main Grants.gov website, select Applicants and register your organization. You'll have to have your DUNS and SAM information handy. All right. Okay. Grants.gov has a specific how to apply for grants section of the website with lots of tools and resources to help you. There's also a video linked here that describes the process of how to register in Grants.gov. The process can take up to several weeks to complete, so it's important to start this process as soon as possible. This can be a place where applicants may fall behind and therefore miss the application deadline as a result. You don't want this to happen to you. Another reminder, DUNS, SAM, and Grants.gov systems are not F&S systems, which is the part of the agency that we work for. So it's important that you actually reach out to those systems directly if you have questions, rather than reaching out to us through the contact information that we provided on these slides and in the RFA. So going back to Grants.gov, the E-biz POC is a single individual at your organization who essentially acts as a gatekeeper to authorize other users within Grants.gov. They assign key roles such as the Authorized Organizational Representative, or AOR. The AOR is the individual who is permitted to submit an application in Grants.gov on behalf of your organization. This is very important because if an individual submits the application for their organization but is not the AOR, Grants.gov will reject it. This can be particularly problematic if it happens right at the submission deadline without enough time to reassign that AOR role before the deadline passes. Workspace is the Grants.gov platform that allows grantees to work on their grant applications in a secure, online, collaborative environment. The grant application can be updated and worked on, but by multiple authorized users at the same time. Ultimately, the grant application is officially submitted through the Grants.gov workspace. After submitting your application, you will receive several emails from Grants.gov. The first email simply states that Grants.gov has received your application and is verifying if there are any errors with the application package. This is not an indication that the submission was successful, yet. Grants.gov will then send another email that will indicate if there are errors or not within your application. If there are no errors, this email will indicate that the application was successfully accepted by Grants.gov or validated. Otherwise, you may have to make changes and resubmit. Applicants will be given a Grants.gov tracking number to track the submission status. We recommend submitting the application at least 1 to 2 weeks prior to the deadline to account for any issues and ensure that you submit a complete application. Applications must be submitted in Grants.gov by 11:59 Eastern Standard Time on December 13th, 2019. Again, we recommend starting the process early, especially if this is your first federal grant application, to avoid any last-minute issues. I've mentioned a few times that USDA has some resources available on our website to help you prepare your application. Well, what I've been referring to is this Resources for Grant Applicants website. It has a link to the RFA, frequently asked questions, a match calculator, sample budget narrative, and much, much more. The RFA and FAQs, alongside the resources on this website, are your guide to creating a successful application, and they provide much more detail about many of the topics we discussed today. Another useful resource for applicants is the list of awarded grants from past grant years. This can help applicants understand what types of grant projects have been awarded in the past. Additionally, USDA generates periodic reports with state-level information on grant applications and awards. Oops. Okay. Applicants may also want to sign up for the DIRT. This is USDA's e-newsletter, and you can stay abreast of the latest grant information alongside other farm-to-school updates. Travis and Robert, there's a fire alarm going off in our building, so I'm going to hand this over to you to handle the Q&A, and unfortunately, I'm going to have to leave the building.
Thank you, Andrea. I'm sorry for the inconvenience, and we appreciate folks hanging in with us. Travis, I'm going to be unmuting your line right now.
Robert, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Dawn, you are unmuted as well. We're going to be muting Andrea because of the fire alarm. So we are going to be moving right into our Q&A. So we've been receiving a number of questions from folks. What we also want to let people know is that we will do our very best in the time remaining to address the questions that we have received. If we have not been able to get to your questions, we will try to get back to you directly regarding questions that we may not be able to address live on the phone here today. But some questions may need some additional research, and we hope to follow up with you shortly. So, with that, Travis, I'm going to start working through some of the questions in the Q&A pool in order, and hopefully you and Dawn can be able to handle some of these responses. Does that sound good to you?
It does. I already have 2 responses queued up, so I can go ahead and say those while you're flagging some other questions if you think that timing would work well.
Fantastic. Go ahead, Travis.
Okay, the first question I have flagged says, so is the focus of planning and implementation grants really focused on schools and not focused on ECE, by which I believe you mean early childhood education? The response is that funding for implementation and planning grants is available to support school-based programs only. If a proposal seeks to increase local foods in the CACFP or the SFSP, the Child and Adult Care Food Program or Summer Food Service Program, Target sites must be located at an eligible school. If a proposal from a non-school entity seeks to target schools with farm-to-school activities, schools benefiting from the project must be eligible as defined in the RFA. And the second question I have queued up is, in Florida, the adult portion of the Child and Adult Care Food Program is administered by Department of Elder Affairs. Could they apply as a state agency? The response to this question is, eligible state agencies include any state-level agency working to promote farm-to-CNP activities in eligible schools. State agencies applying to the state agency track are eligible to work with non-school-based child nutrition program operators that participate in a program under the National School Lunch Act, such as community-based SFSP sites and CACFP sponsors. Thank you
Thanks,
both
Travis.
for your questions. Thank you, Robert.
Okay, we have another question here from a participant. If you are a pre-K to 8th grade public school and are looking to expand the USDA food program with a garden, greenhouse, and local sourcing of food, which grant is best, implementation or the state agency track? I can answer part of this really quickly. The state agency track is specifically intended for state agencies and state agencies only. So if you are applying from a public school, you are not eligible for the state agency track. You would be eligible for either the planning or the implementation track. Based on this information, it sounds like your program would be looking at the implementation track, but Travis or Dawn, you can correct me if I'm wrong with there.
Robert, I do want to point out that I did address this in the Q&A, so you definitely were correct about the state agency track being restricted to state agencies, and implementation grants are appropriate for eligible entities with established partnerships, a defined farm-to-school objective or objectives, and or past success implementing farm-to-school activities. And I encourage any prospective applicant who is not sure which track they should apply for, especially if they're torn between planning and implementation, to review section 1.3 of the RFA, Grant Tracks, where each of the grant tracks is described in greater detail.
We have another question where a participant has asked what qualifies as local procurement. What is understood as local is defined specifically by the locality or the school food authority. Travis, is there anything you'd like to add regarding the issue of local procurement and what would qualify?
Robert, I think you hit the nail on the head that local is up to the procurer.
Okay. Let's see. So, Dawn, I'm hoping you can help us with this. Cooperative extension funding. Is this considered funding that could be used towards the applicant's match requirement?
Okay, please excuse me because I sound horrible. I'm dealing with a cold. I want to say the answer to that is yes, but I do want to confirm because I do not want to misspeak.
Okay.
But I am 90% sure that the answer to that is yes, but I think we should follow up just to be sure.
Okay, thank you very much. We will confirm that answer after the call. Next question, can an application focus solely on planning, implementation, a school garden program, or is it important to include a school, local food procurement, and agricultural education program as well? Travis?
Please note in response to this question that for planning grants, to help ensure that awarded projects align with Farm to School Grant Program goals, eligible entities are required to propose project activities that support the objective to improve access to local foods in eligible schools by developing a comprehensive farm-to-school program that includes local procurement and agricultural education. The requirement is similar for implementation grantees or implementation applicants. Eligible entities are required to propose project activities that support the objective to improve access to local foods in eligible schools by implementing or expanding a comprehensive farm-to-school program that includes local procurement and agricultural education efforts.
We have another construction costs question. So do construction costs in the unallowable section include supplies for infrastructure projects? Also, can travel costs awarded in the grant be used to cover mandatory training for the mandatory USDA training for the grant awardees?
This is Dawn. I responded to that in the Q&A, I believe, but when we talk about construction, we're referring to foundational, anything that needs some type of foundation, those types of costs are not allowable. In regards to buying equipment to build, I think, again, for the infrastructure, whether it be a pipe for a greenhouse of that nature, those are allowable expenses. And
Okay.
yes, travel for the mandatory conference may be charged to the grant.
Okay.
For more information about travel to the mandatory face-to-face meeting, I would direct applicants to Section 3.3 of the RFA, Additional Eligibility Requirements, the second bullet under that section.
Another construction and equipment question. If our program is looking to build an aquaponics farm at a school, the equipment costs to build it are allowable, but not the construction costs incurred. Is this correct?
Correct.
So an additional question, how much funding is available and how does this compare to years past? How many awards do we expect to make, and what percentage of applicants were awarded relative to applications received in this past round?
Robert, $5 million is provided to the Department of Agriculture on an annual basis for grants, technical assistance, and administrative costs related to USDA's Farm-to-School program. Additional funding for the Farm-to-School Grant Program was made available through the fiscal year 2018 and fiscal year 2019 agricultural appropriations. As a result, up to $10 million will be awarded under this solicitation. And in the fiscal year 2019 application and award cycle, the Food and Nutrition Service received 229 eligible applications and funded 126 applications, which came out to 55% award rate.
Thank you very much. Would building a school garden count as construction for the budget? I think we did touch on this, but Travis, Dawn?
No, that would not count as construction as long as, again, there is not a foundation that's being laid.
Foundational element.
Right. That's the key.
Okay. Are equipment costs over $5,000 an allowable cost? There were two references in the RFA. One said equipment was allowable. The other said equipment costs were not. Can you please clarify?
Yes, this is Dawn again. Yes, that was a mix-up in the RFA. Equipment cost, there is no limit on the amount of a piece of equipment as long as it is relevant and allocable for your specific grant project. One thing to keep in mind in regarding equipment when it comes to completing the 424A for your budget, FNS looks at equipment or defines equipment as any item that has a shelf life over 1 year and costs more than $5,000. Any item that is less than $5,000 and has a lower shelf life, we consider that as a supply. So even if you went out and bought a refrigerator for $4,200, that would not be considered equipment and listed on the equipment line item, but it should be included under your supplies.
Thank you, Dawn. Travis, another quick question here. Does the term local procurement include food grown in a school garden?
This is a good question. This may be one where we need to follow up after the webinar. And if this is a concern for many applicants, we can create an entry in the frequently asked questions document that we intend to put online.
Okay. Let's see. Is the mandatory training held in Washington, D.C., and when will this be held? I can answer this one. I believe the mandatory training that we're referencing to is the annual grantee gathering that is held by the Office of Community Food Systems for grantees. The location of the grantee gathering circulates throughout the country on an annual basis. We have not selected our city for this upcoming grantee gathering, but that city selection process and information process happens closer to the grantee selection itself.
For additional guidance about how to budget for this trip with an unknown location, please refer to Section 3.3 of the RFA, Additional Eligibility Requirements, and see the bullet that says applicants should estimate 3 full days of travel, including hotel, airfare, meals, etc. When budgeting for these costs, please assume that attendance will require air travel to a venue at least 2 states away from your own.
We have one question. I'm not sure if we're going to be able to do this. Can you please go over the AOR again and the possibility of an application being rejected?
I can try to jump back in there. I'm trying to get to I can't get to that page. But the authorized official, I'm not sorry, I lost train of thought. I'm sorry. Forgive me for this cold. If you go to the Grants.gov website, there is extensive step-by-step instructions that are listed there, as well as and I'm trying to pull up the section, the RFA. Travis can kind of, Section 4.6, submit an application. And the RFA also gives you additional details concerning submitting and the ARR. In regards to rejection, I don't remember the specific question. However, if your application is rejected, you will be notified. You will get that email from, from Grants.gov, and they will tell you pretty much why it was rejected. But again, I direct you to go to the Grants.gov website and to the that section 4.62 on submitting the application for that. Or you can also send another email, and then we'll follow up with more if you have something more specific, if it wasn't answered.
An additional question, would the repair of an already existing greenhouse work as an allowable cost under a planning grant?
I think we will need to get back to you on that and see how exactly what type of repairs are being requested and how it relates to your specific project.
Okay. If an organization has not received a farm-to-school grant, are they required to apply for the 12-month grant, or can they apply for the 12 to 24-month option?
If an organization, Robert,
I'm not necessarily sure what this question means exactly. I think someone said something similar, and
and Travis, you can speak more to it perhaps after I've finished my statement. The way I interpret that is I've never received a grant, and I want to know which type am I eligible to apply for. I think that will be based on what your experience is and what you're planning to do. If you have no plan for a grant, no plan in place, then of course you would need to be in the planning stage. If you already have an established project that you will want to push forward and build from, then I think you can go into the implementation stage for the 12th to the 24th month. Of course, if you're a state agency, you would go under the state agency track. Does that help you formulate a better response, Travis? I think we had one of those to come in via email as well.
I think that mostly covers it, Don.
Okay. Here's another good one. After reviewing the application materials, it appeared possible to apply with more than one school in mind. But when we went to the actual application, it wasn't clear how we would account for multiple schools. Is it possible to work with more than one school with a given project?
I can respond to this one. Yes, it is allowed to work with more than one school. If there are more than one schools involved, I would need to know more about where exactly you encountered the confusion in the application package. But if you are working with more than one school, you're able to indicate that on the Farm to School cover sheet.
Hold on for a moment. Okay, so we've already addressed the mandatory meeting. Okay. If there are a number of questions where we did not quite have enough information, if there are people on the line who have asked questions and would like to ask follow-up questions, we encourage you to ask follow-up questions through the Farm to School inbox, which is at farmtoschool@usda.gov. And we will be able to, address those follow-up questions after the call via email. Another question that we received: can a project apply for state and implementation grants to fund different parts of the same project? For instance, is there potential to receive $100,000 for implementation and $100,000 for the state agency grant, both contributing to one project? So I guess, can two applicants pool their projects together into one larger project?
Robert, I interpreted this question differently as an applicant wondering whether they could apply for two grants. The applicant must choose between submitting a planning, implementation, or a state agency grant request, and may only submit one application. Only one grant application per entity is permitted.
Okay.
Dawn, I don't know if you have additional input on that.
No, I interpreted the question the way that you did.
I apologize for the confusion. Does an application from a state agency need to address statewide goals, or can a state agency, be the lead applicant on behalf of one public school district?
I would have to follow up about that.
Okay. Are wages for garden and/or agricultural educator positions allowable in the grant budget?
Say that one more time.
Are wages for a garden/agriculture educator position allowable?
yes, if it's relevant to your grant project, salary expenses are allowable.
Okay. Can we apply as a pre-K school that is a nonprofit organization? We are not part of a elementary school, but we are a SFA as PK.
I can reiterate the information earlier about CACFP and SFSP programs. The funding for implementation and planning grants is available to support school-based programs only. If a proposal seeks to increase local foods in the CACFP or the SFSP, target sites must be located at an eligible school. And in addition, regarding the question about nonprofit status, for the purposes of this grant program, any nonprofit, private, or charter school must apply as a school or school district regardless of 501c3 status. I hope that answers each component of the question. If not, please feel free to follow up at farmtoschool@usda.gov.
Another good follow-up here. Is it required to apply for a planning grant before you are allowed to apply for an implementation grant?
That is not required. I encourage anyone concerned about which grant track they should apply for to carefully review Section 1.3 grant tracks, which goes into detail about the requirements for each, the expectations for each, and also Section 3.0 eligibility information, which provides additional detail about which entities are eligible for which tracks.
Additionally, regarding hydroponic equipment that costs $1,000 per unit. However, the aggregate total of the project for hydroponics equipment is greater than $5,000. Is this eligible as an equipment expense even when the individual unit cost is $1,000?
It is the per unit cost, so it's eligible, but we request that you note that as a supply, only because again, it's the per unit cost that has to be more than at $5,000. So it is an allowable expense, and though it's a piece of equipment, it's deemed as a supply, so it should be listed on the supply line item and noted as a supply under your narrative.
Thank you, Dawn.
Robert, I see a question I'd like to respond to.
Go ahead.
Because I have an answer handy. The question is, would a county-run soil and water conservation district be considered a state agency or local agency, or can a soil and water conservation district apply for the implementation grant? Local agencies are considered to be any unit of government within a state, including a county, borough, municipality, city, town, township, parish, special district, or council of governments. So please review the requirements for eligibility of each track in Section 3.0, which goes into greater detail about what the definitions are for each eligible entity.
We have another great practical question that I know has come up in the past, which is why I want to flag it today. Part of the grant asks for staff resumes. We have staff in place who would be participating in the farm to garden. Is there a problem if someone leaves the school and another person takes their place as the grant is being implemented?
I can take it. No, that is not a problem. We understand that you may have some turnover in your staff. In regards to staff resumes, we require resumes for all key personnel. So if someone leaves and they are a key component to, be considered a key personnel to your staff, then we will need to see the resume of the person who is to replace the exiting staff person, and that will be great to have it prior to that person's arrival and joining your team.
Thank you very much. Can non-federal matching funds come in the form of percentages of participating school staff salaries?
Yes.
Excellent.
The key thing on matching and for salaries, you must keep track of all salaries. You must keep a log that way so that you are able to determine the actual amount that is being contributed towards the grant.
Okay. We have another question, and Travis, this is something, just a procedural question. Will questions asked today be added to the Q&A sheet?
That's an excellent question. Many of the questions discussed on this webinar are covered in some way in the FAQ document that we intend to publish this week. The ones that we receive a high volume of questions of a certain nature may be added at a later date, and the updated FAQ posted to both the Grants.gov page under the Supporting Documents tab and the Resources for Grant Applicants page on the Office of Community Food Systems website. I recommend bookmarking both of those pages and checking them frequently to make sure that you're working off of the most up-to-date document.
We have another question. Do priority categories include tribal governments? We are part of a program of a tribal government. I saw that tribal organizations are included.
That's a great question, and I can respond easily. Applications from Indian tribal organizations, ITOs, and entities serving tribal communities are considered funding priorities for fiscal year 2020.
Excellent. Okay, this will be our last question. For questions that we have not been able to address, we're going to try to get back to them as quickly as possible. Okay, let me just get to it. Is it allowable for the majority of a planning grant budget to fund salary for a full-time position to oversee the entire process and the project? Seemed that the awards granted posted last year listed project actions, but not how they were funded. If possible, and then it gets cut off. So I think this is a use of funding for salaries.
For salaries, yes. And again, salaries are allowable. We will have to see it in its totality to see if it's balanced with your grant project. So we can't tell you off the back whether or not it's a yes or no question. Again, it's just based on whether or not it's sufficient support for your grant project.
Okay. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today. Our hour is up. We are going to be working to get this recording up online as soon as possible. We will also be working to go through the questions that we've received and update our materials accordingly. We thank you for your interest, and we look forward to seeing your applications this December.